Much of what we think we know about the Druids is rife with common misconceptions as a result of mythology and propaganda. Let's set the record straight. Plato once wrote, "I know one thing, and that is that I know nothing." That rather astute observation is exactly the mindset you need to be in when you approach the Druids, which is to say, we basically know nothing about them. Despite being a literate culture, the ancient Celts had a rule against writing down their knowledge, lest it fall into the wrong hands. So everything was passed down orally and learned by heart. As a result, there are no first-hand accounts of the ancient Druids. More or less, the only ancient information we have about them comes from Roman writers like Julius Caesar, who was there to conquer and subdue the people of Gaul and Britain, and Pliny the Elder, who attributes the wiping out of the Druids to the Emperor Tiberius. The Roman reason for wanting to both destroy the Druids and skew the historical record of them was not because of the hideous rituals they supposedly performed, more on that later, but because when conquerors want to subdue a culture, the first thing they typically do is put down their cultural and intellectual leaders. Since so much of what we supposedly know about Druids comes from their enemies, it's important we take these myths with a grain of salt. The word Druid in modern times has become almost synonymous with pagan priest or something similar. The idea being that they were holy men like shamans with a mystical connection to the natural world. They performed strange rituals and spoke for the trees like they were the Lorax or something. But while it is true that the Druids were a religious class among the ancient Celts, the fact is they were also much more than that. According to Caesar's account, the Druids were one of two esteemed social classes among the Celts, with the other being the Equites, Celtic knights or noblemen. The Druids were not only priests, performing both public and private sacrifices, they also served a judicial role, arbitrating disputes and issuing punishments. Additionally, they were teachers, studying such topics as philosophy, astronomy, science, and religion, and then passing that information on to others via their oral tradition. It could take up to 20 years of study to become a Druid, which seems like a lot, but at least you didn't spend the next 20 paying off student loan debt. Another plus is that Druids didn't have to serve in the military or pay taxes. Druids would also have been political advisors and even the chiefs of some Gallic tribes. They would have also been trained in the medical arts. In short, the Druids were basically living storehouses for all human knowledge. Just about everyone is familiar with the megalithic monument on the Salisbury Plain, Stonehenge, the UNESCO World Heritage Site where a man is a man and the children dance to the pipes of Pan. But was this world-famous landmark in fact built by the Druids, as Spinal Tap's Nigel Tufnell claims?
In ancient times, hundreds of years before the dawn of history.
Well, in short, no. The idea that the Druids built Stonehenge began with 17th century archaeologist John Aubrey and was then popularized by antiquarian William Stukeley. The idea has taken such a firm root in popular consciousness that even today, modern people who identify as neo-Druids gather at Stonehenge to celebrate the solstice. As with many cool ideas, science is the one to blame for ruining this theory. Radiocarbon dating shows that the stones of Stonehenge stood on Salisbury Plain more than 1,000 years before the Celts came to the British Isles from continental Europe. The monument was likely built by a number of successive tribes native to Britain, beginning with some Stone Age farmers. Regrettably, this definitely rules out another even more awesome theory for the origin of Stonehenge, namely the claim by Geoffrey of Monmouth that Stonehenge was magically built by Merlin with stones stolen from giants to be a mass grave for Britons killed in the battle with the Saxons. Okay, let's get this out of the way first. You're almost certainly pronouncing this word wrong. It's very easy as an English speaker to look at the name and think Samhain, as happens in tons of TV shows and movies about Halloween. But in Irish, the MH letter combo is pronounced like a W, so a better approximation of how it should be said is Samhain. Now you know, and you can lord that over your friends. It's something you always hear as Halloween approaches. Our fun candy and goblin holiday was originally a celebration of Samhain, the Celtic god of death. This might have been the reason your religious parents didn't want you to go trick-or-treating. Who would want their innocent child participating in a pagan ritual celebrating death? But the question is, did the Druids worship a death god named Samhain in October? Actually, no. This misconception has its roots in a book from 1770 by a weird writer named Colonel Charles Valency, who wanted to prove the Druids came from Armenia for some reason. So what is Samhain actually? The word Samhain just means summer's end and represents a shifting of the seasons from summer to winter, kind of a New Year's Eve. So it's not a deity at all, it's just a holiday. Let's look at a few details of how the Druids are imagined in popular conception. Many people view Druids as ascetic, male, celibate priests wearing a long white beard and long white robes. It's probably what you've pictured this whole time, and no wonder. It's what's popularly depicted in art, even in works going back centuries. The reason that depictions of Druids have been traditionally male is due to the fact that the classical sources don't mention any female Druids. This is likely because these classical writers themselves came from male-dominated societies. But Druids actually believed in equality between men and women, with women acting as Druids, warrior queens like Boudica, and ambassadors. Further evidence of female Druids comes from the fact that there were multiple words for female Druid in the Irish language, including the word Bondry, which literally means woman Druid. The traditional image of a Druid in a long white robe comes about as the result of a mistranslation. In a passage describing the importance of the oak tree and mistletoe to Druidic faith, Pliny the Elder describes the Druid as a, quote, priest clad in a white robe. However, later Latin dictionaries actually show that the word translated as robe is actually more a generic term for clothing rather than a robe specifically. So what we know then is that Druidic priests wore white clothes of some kind, specifically when they were climbing a tree to gather mistletoe. Most likely, the Druids wore white tunics and cloaks rather than robes. Additionally, Druids were known to carry gilded rods made of straight white wood as a sign of their office. They also wore cloaks made of gray or white bullhide. The fact that many Druids seem to have received the nickname male, meaning bald, indicates the Druids may have traditionally worn the tonsure, later common among Christian clerics in Ireland. This hairstyle is distinguished from the tonsure worn by monks elsewhere, Friar Tuck being a classic example, by instead being clipped from ear to ear along the hairline, making you instead look like you have a huge forehead rather than a bald spot. As with most things, we don't know a ton about what Druids actually believed. However, we do know that one of their major beliefs is in the immortality of the soul. Like diamonds, souls are forever, and if you die, your soul reincarnates into another body. They also believed that the soul rested in the head rather than the heart, which is actually surprisingly advanced if you think about it. How many people still think of the heart as the seat of emotion and spirit when, by now, science, which we know is great at ruining things, has proven that it's all just chemicals swirling around in our head? That said, there is a current of belief that the ancient Druids were monotheistic, practicing a kind of proto-Christianity. This has its roots in the modern revival of Druidism in the 18th century. The closeness to nature of the Druids would have appealed to the romantic sensibility of that time. But the dominance of Christianity throughout Europe influenced those neo-Druids to fuse their own religious beliefs with their imagined conception of the Ancient One. The Celts were in fact quite polytheistic, believing in various gods and goddesses, which probably helped prime them to understand the Trinity when St. Patrick came along with his shamrock metaphor. Okay, this one is a little tricky. Caesar reports somewhat famously that the Druids would perform human sacrifices by building a giant man out of twigs, filling that man with actual living people, and then burning it to the ground. This has been a fairly resonant image for people, inspiring one of the all-time greatest horror films, The Wicker Man. The 1973 original, of course, and not the 2006 version with Nicolas Cage and bees.
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees! Ah! Open my eyes! Eyes! Ah!
Pliny the Elder would go even further in his claims, stating that the Druids practiced ritualized cannibalism, believing they gained strength from consuming the flesh of their enemies. In more modern times, some would claim that this was nothing but anti-Druid propaganda on the part of the Romans and that there was no archaeological evidence of human sacrifice in Ireland. Unfortunately, science once again has to ruin things. There is, in fact, quite a bit of evidence of human sacrifice by the Druids, not the least being a man who was strangled, bludgeoned on the head, and then had his throat slit, a practice known as the threefold death as referenced in later writings. However, it's safe to say that there were probably no sacrifices using a wicker man. Though there is evidence of wicker men in Celtic culture, they would have been images used for processions and other less violent religious purposes. The popular image of Druids is of bearded ascetics, and one of the additional elements of that is the idea of celibacy. This is a claim that is further spread by the book The 21 Lessons of Merlin, which alleges to be based on a never-before-published manuscript of Druidic teachings called the Book of Furisht. However, the Book of Furisht is fake. Historians have made careers out of developing point-by-point rebuttals of the many claims of the book. One of the things that these Druidic scholars are likely to point out is that Druids were definitely not celibate, either in history or in legend. For one thing, there are stories of Druids who are children of other Druids, and one of the famous Celtic kings was said to be the son of a Druid. Furthermore, they were a hereditary caste. If they didn't get married and have children, there would be no more Druids. First off, let's acknowledge that this is definitely not a myth that everyone believes, because obviously our viewers are quite smart and are familiar with the history of Atlantis, and they know that it's a metaphor and not a real place. As a result, it's fair to say that only metaphorical people can come from the fabled lost city. However, you're probably pretty aware that facts never stop some people. That includes notable crackpot Ignatius Donnelly, who claims in his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, that the Druids, and indeed a large number of Irish races and classes, came from Atlantis. The idea took root enough that it is part of the 21 Lessons of Merlin, as well as being widespread enough that the Modern Druidity website acknowledges that it is a thing that some people believe. So, what eventually happened to the Druids if they didn't just return to Atlantis? Aside from being systematically wiped out by the Romans, it suggested that they probably assimilated with Christians once the Romans showed up. The fact that there aren't any Irish martyrs from ancient times shows that it was a pretty peaceful transition, despite the fact that medieval Irish literature shows the Druids as powerful wizards resisting Christianity tooth and claw. Their holy wells became Christian holy wells, their tonsure became Christian tonsure, and so on. In this way, it's not impossible to imagine that a bit of the ancient Druids still survives with us today. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite stuff are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.